I'm going to talk today about this paper, Compelling with the Bomb, Revisiting the Effectiveness of Nuclear Compellant Threats. It's co-authored with my old GW colleague, Charlie Glazer, who might be out there on the Zoomosphere. He said he might zoom in, but I don't know. So those of you who have any familiarity with nuclear weapons or nuclear security, there's a lot of debates ongoing these days. So the classic ones about nuclear deterrence or mutual assured destruction, what's called the nuclear revolution, right? That states with nuclear weapons were very good at deterring aggression against them. And that's recently been challenged by a bunch of work. Then there's the whole literature on nuclear proliferation. Is this why do states want to acquire the bomb? And then what are the consequences of those? There have been big debates about whether that makes the world a safer or a more dangerous place. Then there's work on getting nuclear weapons and whether that makes you more aggressive, makes you more of a revisionist actor out there, and there's a number of viewpoints on that. Where we're going to land is this recent debate on nuclear compellence. There's some older work on this by Dick Betts, but been a flurry of stuff in the last 10 years or so on the effectiveness of nuclear weapons and nuclear threats for changing the status quo, right? For trying to compel other states to do stuff. So the question we're asking here is, are nuclear compellant threats effective at eliciting concessions from other states? Or under what conditions are they effective at doing that? So what's a nuclear compellant threat? We define it as it's a demand by a nuclear weapon state. That's what that means, that an adversary make a change in the status quo, right? So a compellant demand and a threat to use nuclear weapons if the target doesn't comply. And it need not be, oh, we're going to nuke you 3 ways from Sunday. It can be signaled tacitly by doing something with your nuclear arsenal. And we think the answer to this matters these days for things that are going on in the world. I mean, for one, it affects your view of how dangerous nuclear proliferation is. Or if you think nuclear weapons aren't any good for compellence, you can take a little more relaxed attitude towards more countries getting them. It affects your view of arsenal size, because as I'll tell you here in a minute, there's a school of thought that's, the more nuclear weapons you have, the better it is for compellence. And then for cases that are going on now and may yet occur, the Russia-Ukraine war, a US-China war over Taiwan, we could see nuclear compellant threats in those cases. And so we think this is of continuing relevance. So I'll say more about this in a minute, but the sort of current literature is highly polarized. That's the American politics version. There's basically a yes, nuclear superiority, good. More nuclear weapons. The more nuclear weapons you have, the bigger nuclear advantage you have. That's good for compellence. No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many you have. They don't convey any compellence. Oops, didn't mean to go. They don't convey any compellant advantage. So how would we answer this question? What do we need to know to try and answer this question? First, we need a consistent unit of analysis. The literature so far has looked at compellant threats. It's looked at international crisis outcomes. We want to focus on nuclear compellant threats, like not just sort of any international crisis outcome. So then we need a good definition of what a nuclear compellant threat is, which is focused on nuclear threats, not just on having nuclear weapons. Third, we need a sort of idea, framework of conditions that might affect the effectiveness of nuclear compellence. And then last, and this is sort of where one of our contributions comes in, is an understanding of how crises evolve and how that then affects the outcome of these crises. So these kind of things are not usually just bolts from the blue, although there are some exceptions. There's a series of steps that are involved, and that can affect the way that the thing turns out. So how are we going to address those questions? Well, like I said, we're going to focus on nuclear compellant threats, not international crises. We're going to define nuclear compellant threats, NCTs, as a compellant demand plus a nuclear threat. We're going to lay out a set of variables that could influence nuclear compellant threat outcomes. And then we're going to talk about how this sort of selection process, how states jump in and out of crises depending on their interests and their perceptions of their adversaries' interests, affects those and can neutralize pre-crisis variables. Okay, so our answer has kind of two parts, but to give the bumper sticker first, we're not a yes or a no, we're kind of an in-between. Right? There's sort of no unconditional answer here. And the reason is strategic selection. Why? So we kind of draw on the crisis bargaining literature to argue that these kinds of threats usually result from a series of steps, and that each side is selecting in and out of the crisis based on its interests, and as the crisis progresses, the less resolved states are going to drop out. And so by the time you get to a nuclear threat, you've got really highly resolved states on both sides, and therefore it's really hard to predict the outcome based on, say, we had a bigger nuclear arsenal beforehand, or we had a bigger conventional arsenal, or something like that. What's going to matter is the signaling in the crisis itself, because you have two highly resolved states. It's kind of a toss-up, and so it's going to matter what they do in the crisis itself. The exception to this is when NCTs come as a surprise. And then you have no opportunity to select out based on the signaling that's going on. And this can happen in either you don't know the adversary has nuclear weapons, which has happened in one case, Japan in 1945, or you don't believe it's a nuclear crisis. Right? This is very common. Right? States are bargaining in a crisis, and they think it's not a nuclear crisis, and then boom, a nuclear threat is made. Or a previously uninvolved party jumps in and makes a nuclear threat, which has happened in a couple of cases. And in those, nuclear weapons can matter more directly because you haven't been able to go through this weeding out process. Whoops, went ahead a little bit too fast there. So there, you might expect nuclear weapons to affect the outcome more directly. All right, so here's how I want to go forward. I'll say a little bit more about the existing literature, and then define nuclear compellence, say what the case universe is, talk about our theory of effectiveness, and then give a little bit of empirical evidence from the Sino-Soviet crisis of 1969, and then conclude. Okay, so the current literature, for those of you who are old enough to remember this, I know some of us here have grizzled veterans of the 70s and 80s. It has a bit of this feeling, right? Tastes great, less filling, right? On the one hand, we have people arguing, yes, nuclear coercionists, we'll call them, that superiority matters, right? And having a lot of nuclear weapons matters, either more nuclear weapons than your adversary, or just nuclear weapons and your other side doesn't have any. That's what absolutist and relativist. Then you have the less filling people, the nuclear pessimists, who Todd Sexer and Matt Furman are most prominent here, and they're saying, no, nuclear weapons are not good for compellence. Why? Because compellers usually have really low interest at stake. They have conventional arsenals that allow them to achieve what they want without using nuclear threats. And boy, if you used a nuclear weapon, people will be really mad at you. So you don't want to do that. Now, there's some more sophisticated, I'm kind of caricaturing these positions just for brevity. Some more recent contributions here are a little more nuanced. Right? One is about, criticizes this literature by saying, well, you're just treating like either have nuclear weapons or you don't, or you have 50 and you have 20, not looking at different types of weapons or anything. So we need better measures of the nuclear balance. And what really matters is what states think the balance is, not what we count it as, like how many there are. Then there's a study that starts to get at this selection issue. And it starts to incorporate selection, and it argues that interests are a function of arsenal size. And so when you have a smaller arsenal, you're likely to be more resolved and have higher interest in the crisis, and therefore the credibility of your threats will be greater. This reminds me a lot of, any of you know about some literature on Vietnam and counterinsurgency that said, why do big states go abroad and fail in small wars? It's because by definition, they're very powerful. Their survival's not at stake. They don't care as much as the smaller side. It's the same style of argument. Okay, where do we think things have gone wrong here? A lot of this literature is statistical. It uses large-ish N data sets, and we think that's produced some misleading results. Now, I am not an enemy of statistics. I'm a card-carrying member of the statistics club, I guess. Someone has called me, in fact, a statistics monkey, for which I then brandished a banana and said, yes, I'm a statistics monkey. So this is not a criticism of stats in general, right? It's to this application. So as I said, these studies use different dependent variables, and therefore they have different universes of cases. Some are looking at threats, some are looking at crises. And again, the IV, the independent variable in these studies, is not nuclear threats. It's whether you have nuclear weapons. Do you prevail? Or are your threats more credible? Not whether the threat itself is nuclear. And so you get these data sets that are filled with things that are not nuclear threats. And it's based on the assumption that a lot of people have that nuclear weapons always matter. They're always in the background. They're always influencing things, no matter whether they're invoked or not. This sort of comes from Paul Nitze back in the 1950s. So they're assuming that anytime you have nuclear weapons, they're influencing outcomes. So the upshot is that neither side in this debate is really testing the effectiveness of nuclear threats. They're testing the effectiveness of having nuclear weapons on certain outcomes. So the point here is that, intentionally, I think in some cases, and unintentionally in others, the impression is that there's a lot of cases of these things. But we think there's really only a few. And what are those? So if you look at the studies, these are the big large N studies. They're filled with lots of stuff, but they're not filled with nuclear compellent threats. There's actually very few in these studies. And so our point is, well, if you want to know, about the effectiveness of, or what the conditions under which such a threat would work, you need to look at those things. Okay, a couple more disagreements. These studies don't sort of think about the effects of selection, as we'll go into in a minute. They treat all types of threats as the same, whereas we're going to argue that there's actually a couple different kinds with different implications for effectiveness. And then we disagree with some of the theory that's out there. So the nuclear pessimists, right, they have a conditional theory. They argue that they look at interests, they look at costs of using nuclear weapons, they look at the conventional balance. But they basically say those variables don't vary. They always take values that are disadvantageous to the compeller, whereas we think variables vary. Okay, what is nuclear compellence? So basically, it's pretty simple, we think. It's a compellent demand plus a nuclear threat equals an NCT. So you're making a demand that somebody change the status quo. This is not about deterrence, which is about sort of threatening someone with a consequence if they do something. It's you need to do something or we'll punish you. This can be explicit or implicit. Explicit is better. And then it's a threat. To use a nuclear weapon, not just a conventional threat, but a threat that somehow invokes nuclear use. Rarely you get explicit language. Usually it's the policymaker makes the demand, and then they do something with their nuclear arsenal to send a signal, a tacit signal. So you get something that looks like this. You can have threats that are doubly explicit, right? Very rare. Nikita Khrushchev was sort of the king of this, where he came right out and say, we'll vaporize you if you don't stop attacking, Egypt in 1956. Mostly, as you'll see in a sec, are explicit demands, but the threats are tacit or implicit, like you're doing something with your nuclear arsenal to signal that. And implicit demands, you could think, well, it's sort of clear from the context what the demand might be, or doubly implicit. This is a list of the cases of nuclear compellence in our study. And you'll notice it's not 50, it's not 100, it's 10 cases with 10 threats and 9 cases. And sort of part of our message here is we're kind of like, I don't know, old fuddy-duddies in a way. It's like there's not that many cases of this. And so we need to study those cases to understand what's going on. And you see that most of these are explicit demands with implicit threats. There's not a good, strong correlation, though, between the explicitness of the threat and effectiveness. It helps to be that the demand is explicit, but it's not the case that you have to enunciate it super clearly to make the threat credible. Okay, now, you're probably thinking to yourself, boy, you really tossed out a lot of cases, Downs. And so why did we do that? Now, I didn't think it was fair to send the massive supplemental materials on top of a long paper, but we talk about this, and there's basically 5 kinds of cases that we exclude. Right? Cases where there's no demand or no threat. Right? Those don't belong in here. So Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The Eisenhower administration talked a lot internally about using a nuclear weapon to rescue the French at Dien Bien Phu. But ultimately they didn't, and they never made a threat, and they never made a demand. No demand in a nuclear threat. This seems like a weird one, right? Sort of you can think of Korea. This is Truman's news conference, November 30th, I think it was, saying, well, every weapon has always been under consideration. Does that include nuclear weapons? It includes every weapon we have. But it's not really clear what he wants. And then the next day they're like, no, he didn't mean that. A compellant demand with no nuclear threat. This is most cases in the large N data sets, right, where there are conventional demands made, but there's no hint of a nuclear threat. Think like United States, Britain and France threatening Serbia or the Bosnian Serbs in 1993 or 94 or 95. Like, nobody thinks that these are cases of nuclear threats. Deterrence, right? These are obviously should be excluded. So like the US issuing a nuclear deterrent threat against the Soviets in the Yom Kippur War, that's not part of our case universe. And then we also exclude these cases where the target of your threat is not actually the adversary, it's somebody you want to intervene on your behalf. So, for example, Israel supposedly, does something with its nuclear weapons to signal to the United States that it's thinking about dusting off its nukes during the Yom Kippur War to persuade the Americans to resupply them. Right? We don't want you to do this. So it's a threat based sort of at a third party. And we're excluding those because we're interested in the effect of threats on adversaries, not allies. So a couple of cases of those that get excluded. Happy to talk about those more if people have questions about them later. All right, let's get down to the heart of the matter here, which is our theory, right? So if you think about it, if you know anything about nuclear deterrence, people focus on a number of variables that might affect outcomes here. So we sort of say, here's what we think are the factors that might influence nuclear compellant outcomes. One is the nuclear balance, right? This is the coercionist argument. More nuclear weapons, better. And these are all holding everything else constant. Okay. What's your nuclear vulnerability? Right? What's your how much damage would you suffer, the compeller suffer in a nuclear attack? What are the relative interests? Like, how strong are the interests of the compeller versus the target in the outcome? And also, how important is it just strictly to the compeller in an absolute sense? So you're thinking both how do they compare with each other, and then what's the compeller's absolute interests? Normative barriers, right? There's this thing called the nuclear taboo, right? That a lot of people think is inhibiting the use of nuclear weapons for sure, but possibly also the threat. And the conventional military balance, right? If you have the ability to do something conventionally, you may not want to use. And the bottom, the 3 through 6 there is basically the pessimist argument, right? That the compeller's interests are generally low, lower than the target's. They'll suffer some cost for using nuclear weapons, and they could do it conventionally anyway. So it's kind of assuming that the threatener, the compeller, is a powerful state, right, with a conventional military, a strong conventional military. So we're done, right? That's it. Now we know, like, the factors that affect outcomes of nuclear compellence. And we say no, and why? Why can't we just take those and read off, like, well, this country had this higher interest, this country had this, that. They're obviously going to come out on top. So one reason is, how do I, as an outsider, say how important something is to you, right? We tried doing this, right? So China, Soviet Union in 1969, it's just this border dispute over, like, islands, like where the Thalweg is in the middle of the river that's going to delineate the border. You're like, this is not very important. And yet, it was really important to them. So assigning those kind of things from the outside is really hard. And then the other thing that's going on is that the way crises evolve is going to neutralize a lot of the effects of those variables. Now, what the heck do I mean by this? I know I hear selection and my eyes start to glaze over. So if you're having this, let me try to reassure you. Okay, so 30 or so years ago, the observation was made by Jim Fearon that in his work on crisis bargaining and extended deterrence in particular, which is that crises are processes. They're not just a single event, a single bolt from the blue. And that's what we think is going on with nuclear crises and nuclear threats. And so states can then choose to leave crises as they escalate. And they're looking at their own interests, their own power, and their perception of the other side's power and interests. And so because they're taking those things into account, and if they stay in the crisis, obviously that's not going to affect their decision-making anymore, because they've already taken it into account. And they decided to resist anyway, even if they think they're at a nuclear disadvantage. Maybe their interests are really high. And so they say, it's worth it to us to run this risk to stay in the crisis. How does this apply to nuclear compellence? So we think of crises as evolving, right? Say you and I, me and the other Alex here, have a dispute over some territory. He won't do what I want, so I make a conventional threat against him. He says, forget it, I'm not going to give it to you. I launch a conventional attack, we get into a conventional war, and eventually it's not going well for me, so I threaten him with nuclear weapons, right? So you see there's steps in the process here. At each stage, right, countries that are sort of less capable or less resolved are more likely to drop out, right? Because if you don't have a lot of interest at stake, paying a lot of costs for those doesn't make sense. So over time, as the crisis evolves, you can end up at the end with two states that are pretty evenly matched, right? The target's resolved, the compeller's resolved, and therefore the effects of a lot of those variables that I mentioned get neutralized because you've taken them already into account. I've taken into account the nuclear balance. I've taken into account the conventional balance. I've taken into account what I think your interests are compared to mine. And so you shouldn't see a big correlation between those ex-ante variables and the outcomes because their effects have been neutralized. And what's going to matter, to sort of go back to earlier stuff, Thomas Schelling and so forth, is what happens in the crisis itself, right? How can you signal with the use of nuclear threats that, oh, my interests are way stronger than you thought they were, and I persuade you somehow that I'm willing to use a nuclear weapon to get my way. If the compeller is not willing to do that, the target's going to be like, well, I don't think you're serious, and be more willing to resist, and the threat will fail. Now, all that said, there's one major exception. So in that model, right, it assumes I'm taking into account everything. Like I'm taking into account Alex's blue suit, his maroon tie, his burgundy tie, sorry. Everything about him, his power, his whatever, right? But sometimes states don't do this, right? And it was kind of a big, weird revelation when we started to see this, right? And it can happen in cases where the target doesn't anticipate a nuclear threat. They're just discounting the role of nuclear weapons. They're not really, this is not a big deal. You'll see this in the China case in a minute. This is not a big deal, so I'm not thinking of this as nuclear weapons are not even a possibility, right? These are pretty low-level things. But if the threat comes and you didn't anticipate it, there's no way to select out except by capitulating. Right, so in the first version, which is essentially Japan in 1945, you're fighting a big conventional war, and one side doesn't know that the other side has gotten nuclear weapons. And so all of a sudden, on August 6th, an atomic explosion happens. You've taken into account all the other variables, the conventional fighting, the costs, the interests. The only thing now that is different is the nuclear balance. And so in that case, you would think nuclear weapons might be more persuasive. There's a second version. It's really kind of three versions, but I'm going to smush it into two, is when the target knows that the compeller has nukes, but they don't think that compeller's not in the crisis. So it's a third party sitting on the sidelines that all of a sudden jumps in and makes a nuclear threat. You think, well, that's crazy. But it actually has happened a couple of times in history. And again, you can't really select out, but then you're looking at everything anew, right? So you would look not just at the nuclear weapons, you would look at all of the variables because they weren't in the crisis before, so you have to assess everything. So you would expect maybe those wouldn't be as successful. Okay, so this is the same table I showed you before, just simply divided up by what kind of pathway you get to a nuclear compelling threat through. Is it a surprise? Is it a sort of selection, escalation kind of case? And then sort of codings of outcomes. Now, a couple things here. There's a couple of cases that are so weird and so strange that they're kind of grayed out here, because it's incredibly hard to actually code them because what the compeller did was so strange. So the Madman crisis in 1969, where Nixon did a nuclear alert, but he did it all secretly, and he sent these B-52s armed with nuclear weapons to go fly circles over the Arctic Circle. The idea was to intimidate the North Vietnamese and the Soviets to compromise in Vietnam. But the Soviets had no idea what was going on. They're like, why are they flying those bombers around? What the heck are they doing? They didn't connect it at all. So in those kind of cases, it's hard to make any assessment. Also, you'll see things that are coded succeed, right? This is not a claim that this is the only thing that mattered, right? There are debates on every single one of these cases. And we don't claim to have like, oh, I discovered the magic document in the archives, right, that will convince everyone that the nuclear compelling threat was the thing, right? We think the atomic bomb in Japan was a thing, right, that contributed to the outcome. Okay, and I don't, I put these here for reference. We're talking such small case numbers that it's hard to put any sort of stock in whether there's an actual trend there. Okay, I just wanted to compare sort of what I just talked about to what the existing literature says. So we sort of see the difference. Like with the pessimists, we agree that the actual number of cases is small. They have a large N data set, but they're doing that to test this Nietzschean conventional wisdom that nuclear weapons always matter. And so they're testing any compelling threat by a nuclear weapon state. And they find, no, it doesn't seem that nuclear weapons are constantly lurking in the background helping you win cases. And they say, actually, there's very few threats, actual threats. We agree on some of the variables that are at play, but we disagree about the variables varying. They basically say, they always take these values. We say, actually, they sometimes take different values, and that's where you might see successes. And then we, again, incorporate the selection angle that they don't. For the coercionists, we disagree on the number of cases, the case universe, the effect of nuclear superiority. As you'll see in a minute, the Soviet Union always had more nuclear weapons than China did in 1969, but the Chinese resisted for a long time. In fact, they attacked the Soviets knowing that they had a lot more nuclear weapons than China did. So it can't just be that nuclear superiority is explaining things. Disagree on selection, but we do agree that in some circumstances, nuclear weapons could have an effect. So a bit of agreement and disagreement on all sides here. So let me just quickly, I can't obviously do two in the paper. There's a case of surprise, which is the Japan case. This is the selection case, the Sino-Soviet border crisis. It's really the only case that really follows, and that's what's so, reality is messy. This is really one of the only cases that follows this sort of step-by-step process. Okay, so what's going on here? The Soviets and the Chinese are disputing their border. In early March, the Chinese launch a conventional attack on an island in the middle of the Amur River. There's a second big battle a couple of weeks later. And the Soviet leaders are sort of like, oh my God, what is going on? Right? The Chinese are losing their minds, and they have an enormous army. And we're worried that we could be overrun. And so the Soviets go to the nuclear deterrent threat. Not compellence yet. They're saying, stop, do not continue doing this, or there will be crushing nuclear retaliation. Okay? Then this doesn't work. Right? The Soviets say, let's go back to the bargaining table. It's actually extremely reasonable demand. Let's talk about where the border should be. Not the border needs to be here, or you need to make this concession. It's just simply, will you sit down with us and talk about this? That's the demand. And the Chinese is like, no, we're not going to talk to you. And in June, for example, the Soviets start sending tacit nuclear threats. They send nuclear bombers to do practice bombing runs over mock-ups of the Chinese nuclear facilities that are in the Soviet territory. It's kind of like, oh, see what you're getting at here. Not persuasive to the Chinese. Why? Mao doesn't think this is a big deal. Right? After the March battles, he said, okay, we've made our point. Stop fighting. It's over. This is no big deal. He doesn't perceive the crisis as nuclear at all. So the Soviets, not being able to persuade the Chinese of this, do additional things. And the demand is the same. It's just like, please, just come back to the bargaining table. Be reasonable. All we want to do is talk to you. And the Soviets go out and start talking to other countries about, well, what would you think if we launched a nuclear attack on Chinese nuclear facilities? I got the green light. Let's go. Let's do this. And famously, they do this with some Eastern European countries. And famously, in a conversation in August in Washington between a Soviet diplomat and an American, they say, this is the same thing. Like, what would your opinion, what would the opinion of the USG be if we nuked the Chinese? And I'm sure Stearman about had a heart attack and said, let me get back to you on that one. And the outcome eventually is that the Chinese agree to reopen negotiations. And there's evidence, if you look what's going on in China at the time, it's overwhelming that Mao fears a nuclear attack, that it's going to happen right now. He says, everybody out of the cities. They start to evacuate the cities. They're mobilizing the army. They're sending them out to the border. They're digging air raid shelters in the cities. All kinds of activity going on. So what's happening here? Right, so China has clearly taken a bunch of things into account when they launched this dispute. The Soviets then are like, oh, this seems more important than we thought. But rather than just take this lying down, they escalate. First to nuclear deterrence, then to nuclear compellence. Mao is convinced this is not a big deal for the Soviets. And so he's sort of like, yada, yada, yada. It doesn't take this seriously. It's only when the Soviets really ratchet it up and do these kind of brazen things, like running around saying, well, what would you think if we nuked another country? It's a little bit of an odd thing to do. And then, all of a sudden, there's updating. Like, okay, these guys seem to be serious. There's real sort of hysteria among the Chinese leadership that an attack is going to come. And eventually, they sit down. There's a famous meeting at the Beijing airport between Zhou Enlai and I forget which Soviet official, where they say, okay, here's what we might do. The Soviets keep making the threats, and eventually Mao says, okay, we will restart talks. So it seems there like the nuclear threat, right? The initial nuclear threat sort of wasn't sufficient to overcome Mao's skepticism. And our theory doesn't say like, well, what exactly is it going to take to be taken seriously in this? It's the sort of signaling process, like can you send a big enough? And we don't know what necessarily big enough is. So what do we take from this? It wasn't a nuclear crisis to start. So even clashes, big military clashes between nuclear powers may not be actually a nuclear crisis or a nuclear threat. The values of the variables beforehand didn't directly affect the outcome. What affected the outcome was what the Soviets could do in between in the crisis to try and persuade the Chinese that they were serious. So Soviet nuclear superiority, for example, can't explain this outcome ex ante because China attacked them. They clearly attacked them in full knowledge that the Soviets had nuclear weapons. Okay, so that, oops, sorry, going the wrong way. So that's sort of what we take away from the case. All right, let me just wrap up. So what did I tell you? One thing we're saying is that there's few actual cases of nuclear compellant threats defined the way we want to define them. Now, you could easily say that's too narrow a definition. What happens if you add this case or that case? I'm happy to sort of talk through what we think the sort of robustness of this is to adding other cases. But that's sort of our stand here. And then there's no sort of unconditional answer to this. It's going to be based on the selection process and signaling in the crisis, as well as these surprise cases. So, okay, why does this matter? I hinted at this before. Okay, so think of a Taiwan scenario, right, where there's sort of escalating things going on. And China attacks, the US intervenes. It turns out that China's losing the war, issues a nuclear compellant threat. Would that be taken seriously? The nuclear coercionists would say no. They're nuclear inferior. Why would we take that seriously, right? Our argument would be, well, yeah, it might be because they're, signaling their interests, even though with a smaller arsenal, and then the outcome would depend on sort of what the ultimate signaling would be. Similarly with Russia-Ukraine, right? Imagine a similar scenario. Russia starts losing the war, they issue a nuclear compellant threat, stop attacking, or else. It's not necessarily the case that superiority would explain this. Why? Because Ukraine's highly resolved and has shown that by fighting an intense conventional war for the last 2 years. So how resolved is Vladimir Putin? We would have to see as the crisis progressed. How resolved is NATO? Like what would NATO do in such a situation? So again, in that kind of scenario, we're talking about what is going on in the crisis itself. And as I keep saying this, I'm like, it must not, this can't be controversial, but the fact is that nobody now is really saying this anymore. I think this used to be an argument that was current, but the literature now is like, well, no, it's just a function of these things, and signaling really doesn't have anything to do with it. Okay, that is it. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Okay, so as usual, we'd like to encourage our undergraduate fellows to go first before Professor Desch starts filibustering. Please. Before you say your comment, can you please introduce yourself some?
I'm doing a fellowship program called Inspired Leadership. My question is, if you go back to the table where you're showing all those countries, can you just go back to that?
I don't know, can I go back to that? It's going to take a minute.
Yeah, it's okay.
Bo is getting you back.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, go back.
There's
Second
one.
one.
That
Yeah,
one?
hold, stay there. There you put an asterisk there, and then you say short-term partial success, long-term failure. What do you mean by that?
So in the,
One sec. Is it only for India, or is it all for failures there?
so India made the compellant demand, right? Which was actually 3 or 4 things they asked for. And made a tacit nuclear threat by sort of moving nuclear missiles around. And initially, Pervez Musharraf said, okay, we'll make some partial concession on one of these things. But then he sort of, we'll arrest these guys. And then after a while, he lets them go. And then the other things he never fulfills. So there was some sort of partial compliance early on, but then walked back so that India didn't really get what it wanted to out of the crisis.
Thanks. Terrific paper, Alex. Lots of really interesting stuff, and particularly the distinction between selection and surprise seems very, very useful. I had a couple of questions. The definition of a threat, which you said somehow involves a nuclear threat. What's a nuclear threat? I mean, to say in the middle of a crisis, things could get out of control and this would be ugly, could be a threat that, give in to what I want or I'm going to use nuclear weapons against you. Or it could be a statement of the situation or a deterrent threat. Maybe I'm saying to you, we're fighting over this island in the Amur River. Conventionally, don't think about escalating because nuclear war would be a disaster. But coercion, is not really connected with that. And that, the more I started thinking about it, you're only talking about some cases in which the threat is doubly explicit. And I started thinking maybe only the doubly explicit cases are useful, unless in going through these other cases in detail, you can as clearly make the case that in fact this is about a nuclear compellent threat as opposed to a nuclear deterrent threat, or just an expression of concern that things are getting out of control. The second thing I just wanted to ask you is the NDISC tacit argument.
Yeah.
How do you how do you show that in fact that's not what's going on? I guess it's in a way now I'm arguing out of the other side of my mouth.
I'm never stopped an academic.
Never stopped me. But what's the way to sort of take that off the table? Because it seems to me, unless you're just using doubly explicit, there's always the possibility that somebody's going to come in and, reinterpret or differently interpret ambiguous language in these non-doubly explicit cases.
Okay, so those are good and interesting questions, and it's certainly tricky, a little difficult to parse verbiage sometimes. Let me start with the second one first, which is the NDISC, the assumption that nuclear weapons are always looming in the background, affecting the outcomes of lots of things. Brooding shadow out there, lurking, right? So on the one hand, we look at Sexer and Furman, who basically tried to test this as best they could. And it's not a perfect test by any means, but they look at all compelling threats by states with nuclear weapons, compare them to compelling threats by non-nuclear weapon states, and find that just having nuclear weapons doesn't make your threats more effective. The other way is not wanting to take them solely at their word, is we had an RA investigate every single one of those cases to try to find evidence of the targets saying, well, it could, we thinking about nuclear, this might be happening, and just not being able to find any. And so sort of combining that and looking at the cases that, we've looked at, many of these cases start where the target doesn't even perceive it this way. The one I just talked about is this way. And so our position is that you have to do something. And this is Sexer and Furman's position too. Like, it isn't just a given that nukes are gonna impact everything. There is a credibility problem that you have to overcome. And so doing something verbally or with the arsenal itself has to. So now to get to the first question, so we think actually there's very few actually doubly explicit. There's two, or you have a two-finger follow-up. Yes, excuse me. Mainly what you see is that the demand is being articulated verbally. Do X, or stop doing X. And we have to have that, right? That's step one. Then they could say, or you can be as brutal as Khrushchev and say, what would happen if we attacked you with rocket forces, and 3 would be enough for France and 6 would be enough for Britain, kind of thing. Or more commonly, spinning up the bombers, getting the bombers in the air, getting putting the nuclear missiles on alert, going to DEFCON 2, as in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's that combination of the demand plus the nuclear signal. So yeah, there are these, sort of weirdo cases where leaders sort of say really vague stuff, and they make no other nuclear signal whatsoever. And we're, basically discounting these. But they would actually support our argument anyway, because this nuclear signal is so weak, right, that to overcome, right, these, the credibility problems, you have to send a stronger signal. And so cases like where a demand is made and say let's talk about the Falklands War, right? The British say, Argentinians get out of the Falklands. And there's nuclear depth charges on their destroyers that they send to the region. And they send some bombers that used to be used for nuclear missions to the area. Well, we don't code that as a case because there's not really a nuclear signal involved. But if we did code it as a case, we would predict that it wouldn't be successful because the signal's so weak. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but okay.
Dan.
Yeah, thank you for not trying to have an unconditional theory. That was quite refreshing. But you did say something that was fairly unconditional.
Compared to who?
I won't name
Yeah.
names from the University of Chicago.
We're all tainted by association.
In any case, you did say something fairly unconditional, which was everything depends on intra-crisis signaling. So I'm wondering what you could generalize about signaling. Do you have a typology of signals? What would you look for that changed Mao's mind from discounts to fear to discounts? What do you think about the effectiveness of madman versus costly signaling versus leadership assessment versus force alerts and deployments?
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking, what can you bring analytically to the thing that you say is crucial to the outcome?
Yeah. So as I sort of said there, hinted at the end, we don't have the answer on that necessarily. I mean, but our argument's a costly signaling argument. So the bigger the signal, obviously the more information is conveyed, and presumably the more updating that's done by the target. But we're not saying like, all we can do is look in the case and say, are they doing something relatively explicit? Are they going to DEFCON 2? Are they, moving missiles around? Are they putting the bombers in the air? Things that really sort of would be a precursor to nuclear use? Or are they basically not doing anything like that? The madman case, is basically a complete failure, but this idea that, for those of you not familiar with this is the Richard Nixon, I'm desperate to end the war in Vietnam, so get the word out that I'm gone crazy and I'm, brooding around in the White House basement listening to Rachmaninoff really loud, and don't bother, he'll push the green button at any second. Right, that didn't get him anywhere. In part because this nuclear signal they sent was undetectable to the target. The Soviets thought it might actually be connected with the crisis they were having with China at the same time. And for a long time, historians thought that that's what it was. It was a US deterrent threat against the Soviets in that case. Turns out, no, they were trying to get the North Vietnamese and the Soviets to end the Vietnam War. So I know that's unsatisfying and well, how do you know a costly enough signal when you see it? Well, comparatively speaking, right, we can look at different signals across different cases and say, this is obviously doing more than that. But our contribution here is not necessarily to identify it like a typology of different kinds of signals. Future research should do this.
Kevin.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I just want to know, what do you think that the bearing of these findings have on how we think about the nuclear revolution, or, the nuclear revolution that never was? How do we think about, should we love the bomb? Should we not love the bomb? Because when I look at this table, I see 2 cases in the last 50 years, and everything else before that is, within, before the 70s. And as we know, this was a period of nuclear learning where it's like, are nuclear weapons going to become a tool of warfare, or how should we appreciate these things? And so I just wonder, when I look at this, I'm a bit more optimistic. Yeah, this seems pretty good. These cases are so rare, and that a lot of these things happened before the 70s. Thank you.
So yeah, this is an interesting question. It is true that a lot of these happened sort of in the early years of the Cold War, when the two sides were kind of sorting out what the nuclear revolution was and how did it work, and getting themselves into crises that almost had terrible outcomes. And sort of the nuclear learning argument that I hinted at about, do you get more wild and crazy once you get the bomb? The experience argument is that you get yourself into the Cuban Missile Crisis and you scare the living daylights out of yourself, and that settles you down. So yeah, the things become a lot less common. there's a lot of rhetoric that sometimes is interpreted as nuclear threats. Particularly the North Koreans are terrible at this, right? This is like, how do you parse the language as to something, what is deterrent versus what is compelling? Because often what they're saying is so incoherent that it's really hard to say, but it's usually deterrent. So, you have to have, so the 6 variables I talked about, you can also think of those as factors that would affect whether you made a nuclear compelling threat in the first place. And so you're not usually going to make one of these things over something very minor. And if you did, it wouldn't be very credible. And it turns out that, there's, I don't know, I mean, nuclear, it's hard to say, like, what the sort of, would I be optimistic about this or would I be pessimistic? We're sort of focused on, like, when they're done, do they work or under what conditions do they work, not sort of how frequently they're done, or is there a trend over time? Now, it looks like there is a trend over time, and people have come at us and like, there are really no cases in the last 20 years. We're like, we're trying to find them and not finding them. So in that way, that would be kind of an optimistic stance.
So I'm going to recognize Fritz, who's in virtual land, because I think his question somewhat dovetails on this contemporary relevance question. So the question here is, haven't nuclear compelling threats changed so much since the Cold War that they should be measured differently, assessed differently? And part of that comes down to the fact that Russia has incorporated informational warfare into its arsenal, and so a lot of these nuclear signaling, especially compelling threats, become much more observable, including, for example, leading up to the Ukraine war, countries like Russia, Belarus, the US, Britain, France took it to public statements and made all sorts of nuclear signaling and threat statements that is much more observable. How should we think about the contemporary relevance of your argument?
Well, I mean, I think it still is relevant to today. And you're right, Fritz, out there in cyberspace, that there was a lot of nuclear rhetoric, say, running up to Russia's attack on Ukraine. And then after Russia's attack on Ukraine. And it was deterrent rhetoric. It was, NATO, stay out, don't intervene, or we'll retaliate. So the rhetoric there is, in our estimation, nuclear deterrence. So looking back at the question here, I don't know, looking at cases, say from the early 2000s, that India-Pakistan case, there's a lot of press, there was a lot of messaging from Indian leaders, and it was interestingly couched in deterrence rhetoric, even though what they were doing was a compelling demand, and they were making nuclear signals to back it up. So, one could argue now that it's easier to observe than actually the signaling aspect, which would maybe hint towards, actually there should be more, since we're better at seeing nuclear signals being sent or stuff like that, maybe we would notice more. Obviously, we're not finding that. So, these kinds of things are usually pronounced at very high levels, and when they are said, they get a lot of attention. And so, I mean, if anything, we'd be better able to detect them now than before.
Thank you so much for the talk. I have two questions. The first one, so your argument is about capabilities and commitment, right? And the selection effect simply gets you there, right? But at the end of the day, what's doing the work is capabilities and commitment. And the capabilities thing is fine, but I'm worried about commitment being a tautology here where, well, if they still didn't budge, then they were very resolved, right? My sense of what's happening here is that it's probably very hard to credibly threat a nuclear strike.
Yep.
And that's not necessarily because of high resolve on the other side. You just don't believe the threat, right? And the second point is, so when I was reading the evidence, I couldn't help but have the sense that skeptics might be right here. And especially because looking at your cases, so Japan, US and Japan, I don't think that should be included, right? Because that's a whole different category. There was actually a strike there, 2 strikes there, before the threat of
One strike before the threat.
Right.
August 6th, and then if you don't do what we want,
Right.
threat of rain and ruin like the world has never seen.
But then the whole signaling thing doesn't matter anymore because they...
That's right, it's not a signaling case, it's a surprise case.
Right, but there's no... But even in surprise cases, what you're doing is you're signaling a threat to the other side, right? In the case of the US and Japan, there's no... This element is out of the water. It's simply... They are doing that already, right? So I think that deserves a category, a different category, right? What happened here is the question here is what happens when you nuke a country, not when you threaten to nuke a country, right? And the U.S. and the Cuban Missile Crisis, I also have my doubts because for me that sounds much more like a deterrence case than a compellence one. I know that these definitions sometimes are hard, but you know the Soviet Union they just got there, and the U.S. was trying to draw a line in the sand and say no, that's not going to happen. And then the final case, the USSR and China, that one's fine, but even then it's not a big victory. Yeah. And Mao was kind of like saying, okay, you can nuke us, and we'll simply send more people. And you know, just overall, the evidence seems to be that it's very, very hard to credibly. My takeaway was it's not impossible, but the skeptics are more closer to the truth here than the other side.
I completely agree.
Okay.
This is a very hard thing to do.
Right.
And doubly so because the way crises evolve a lot of time neutralizes some of what might be your advantages. But the skeptics are saying compellers' interests are always low. They always have large conventional capabilities. And there'll always be a big backlash against nuclear use. I think the third is probably true. Whether that's a big deterrent, I don't know. But compellers' interests are not always low, or at least they can try and convince targets that they're higher. And those cases like that I talk about in the conclusion there, those are cases where the compeller has really high interests, and they might be willing to go to great lengths, including like limited nuclear strikes, to convey. And that's, by the way, why I do think Japan is the case. Charlie and I have gone around and around on this, and it's included in some previous studies and not in others. And it's, the threat is, yes, it's been demonstrated, but the threat is then we will continue to inflict this pain on you going forward. So it's the shelling, the threat, the pain that's coming down the road that tries to get compliance, not necessarily the pain that's already been inflicted. So we're like, there's a compellant demand, there's a nuclear threat. Yes, it's weird because the nuclear weapons have never been used before. And so maybe that's off in a class by its own, but it seems to us to fit the definition. On Cuba, yeah, it's a deterrence and a compellence case. So the United States, John F. Kennedy says to the Soviets, don't do anything crazy like put any missiles into Cuba, or else we would react in some way. So there's a deterrent threat that's issued. The Soviets, are not deterred. they violate or go against the deterrent threat. And Kennedy says, boy, I wish I hadn't said that because this isn't such a huge capability difference, but it is a domestic political problem because I made this deterrent threat. And And so the Soviets have gotten missiles and warheads into Cuba. They're in the process of setting them up. They're building the launch pads and all this stuff. And the threat is get them out. So I interpreted that as compellence, because they're doing something and we're saying reverse what you're doing. It wasn't merely like, well, you have them there and you might be thinking about doing something. It's like, you've got them there, you're putting them together, stop doing that, get them out. So that's sort of how we interpret that case. And you're right about the Sino-Soviet case, and none of these cases are clear-cut. Right? We're not saying like, oh, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a great victory for the United States. The United States compromised. In fact, they're both kind of mutually compelled in a way, because the United States made two very big concessions in the crisis. But the Soviets also agreed to take the nuclear weapons out of Cuba, and evidence suggests it was because Khrushchev got convinced that the Americans were going to invade, and that was going to lead to a nuclear war in which the Soviet Union would be destroyed. And so he said, we got to get them out. But Sino-Soviet case, yeah, it's like, will you please just come back to the bargaining table, right? And then, as Todd and Matt point out, Sexler and Furman, the Soviets then make all the concessions in the ensuing bargaining. So yeah, the concession that was won was, not earth-shattering, but it was what they were demanding. So, and the idea that it was just the atomic bomb that is responsible for Japan's surrender, like we all know there's a huge historical fight there. So I'll stop there and hopefully have maybe satisfied you.
I'll have the chance to talk to you later, so
Okay, good,
I'll
good.
push back. But thanks.
Save this for the Rose.
Yeah, so I have several questions. I should try to, I have several questions. But I'll just pick, they're kind of interlinked though, that's sort of the problem. But so I find this paper very perplexing because I feel like the way it's set up and the way and what it delivers are at odds with each other. A lot of the paper is about the selection effects.
Right.
And that seems to be predicting like why we don't see that many cases. But then the paper is supposed to be about success, but then it doesn't really explain success. So is it really about why we don't see that many cases? It's sort of a question of like, what is this paper really about, I guess?
Yeah.
And then what it seems to me that there's this lingering thing going on, which is miscalculation, right? This is how it's been a long time since I've read Fearon, right? But like, my understanding is in these models, the idea is everything's sort of baked in already, right? Maybe you can't observe resolve, so that's sort of the thing that could get mixed up or whatever, but it's just ultimately a miscalculation story, right? Like you end up in these, you don't get the ex ante bargain, you escalate to whether it's a war or a threat or something, because somebody miscalculated what the other side wanted, right? And there's incentives to lie and all this kind of stuff. So like, isn't it always isn't it always a surprise story in a way? Right? Like not surprise in the way that you mean it, like, ta-da, I have nukes, oh, we didn't know these existed. But like, there's always a miscalculation explanation kind of built in. It seems to me, right? And that sort of makes me think, well, maybe you could think about what aspects might make miscalculation stronger or lesser in a particular case or not. Like certainly if they don't know nuclear weapons are there, right? And then I guess this brings me to my third point, so I guess I'm just going to do them all, sorry.
Sure, please.
So I'm also very perplexed by the Cuban Missile Crisis case because it's both surprise and selection.
Yep.
Which, when you only have two cases of success for surprise and two for selection, if one is it's because one of them is coded as double.
Yeah.
So that's like 50% of your cases, which is kind of like, whoa, right? But I guess I don't know, like that sort of, to me, really raises this question of, does this distinction make sense if you can have it be both? And isn't the coding of that case kind of crucial because it can change by that, like it can literally double the number of successes for one or the other case. But just the idea that you could have a case that is both surprise and selection, even though I understand how you explained it, it still just seems like suspect to me, right? And again, it sort of gets me back to this, like where I thought the paper was going is like, hey, really, it only works when there's surprise because all this other stuff hasn't already been taken account of in the selection process. And yet that's not where the paper ended up because it's still successful in some of the selection cases. So it's just strange. I think it's really interesting, though.
All over
But
strange.
Yeah.
No.
That's my thought.
Thank you. No, that all makes sense to me. So, how can it be both? I'll just go backwards. I like going backwards, and starting with Cuba, and it all hopefully links together somehow. So the way the case starts is that Khrushchev believes he can get nuclear missiles into Cuba and operational without the United States finding out. So he's not selecting into a nuclear crisis. He has a nuclear crisis thrust upon him.
There's always a risk, though.
But he's not expecting the things will be operational before they can do anything about it, and hence they'll then be deterred from making a threat. That's his thinking. So he knows the United States has nuclear weapons. It's not like it doesn't know, but he's heavily discounted it, and he thinks he's on this path when he actually ends up on this path, when the Americans do find out and Kennedy makes his threat. Then, after that, though, there are still elements of signaling in the case. With, first when Kennedy makes the speech, we go to DEFCON 3, then we go to DEFCON 2 after that, and then, the blockade line, and, stopping ships and all this kinds of stuff. It also has this sort of, element of signaling to it. And we've gone back and forth like, what is this? And it has elements of both. But I think you're right on that surprise plays a role in most of the successes. In the sense that you just didn't see it coming for whatever reason that it was. Cuba is one. The same thing you could say about Mao. He's just basically, it's not like he doesn't know the Soviets have nuclear weapons. It's just that he's thinking this is not this. This is not there's no nuclear element to this. This is not serious. This is just a little border dispute. We made our point. Now we're done. And our interests, Soviet interests, are not very high in this. Yes. What I'm saying, yes, I'm saying it has an element of surprise, which is when the Soviets then make a really bold move, it has a big effect on him. It has a bigger effect because of his prior beliefs were down here. And that's sort of how, we talk a little bit about in the theory about how you could think of these as a spectrum. All right, with surprise sort of, ideal surprise sort of out here and pure, selection out here. And, where cases fall in there is different. There's rarely just a pure one or the other. But I think the bigger the updating that happens, and this kind of gets back to your point, not saying I know what necessarily is the signal that does that, that happens, the bigger the like, oh my God moment, the more likely success probably is. And to go back to your first point, the perplexedness, that's, upon rereading this paper coming out here, we've gone back and forth about whether we needed a theory of the causes of nuclear compelling threats and a theory of their effectiveness. And we've gone back and forth, and where we ended up is, no, actually a lot of those are the same. But we want to talk about them as here's a set of factors that should influence outcomes of nuclear compellant threats. But I found some language in there that was from the older version about a theory of where these threats come from in the future. So I can certainly see that we conveyed some lack of clarity there. What we're trying to do is say, we're not going to explain where the threats come from necessarily. A lot of these variables could explain that, but you would also think they would have, the reasons that they happen in the first place also affect the outcomes. And we're saying, actually, there's this thing that comes in between that alters the effects of a bunch of these. So if you're still getting that impression, that's our bad.
Okay, I'm going to jump in on the fun here.
Yay.
So, two comments. One is much more brief than the other. So, the first comment is, I think you and Charlie left us hanging some. And the reason is because in the introduction of the paper, you start telling us that, well, compellent success may be very rare, and we need to take into account the role of surprises.
Mm-hmm.
Those are rare, but they may happen. And I started looking throughout the paper to see whether you signpost what those surprises might look like in the future, right? For example, are we just ex ante saying, well, okay, for a lot of these protracted conflicts in the world, maybe surprises just don't happen very much. It's usually like these small things that escalate from conventional to nuclear, and at least one side is like, whoa, why are you doing this, right? Mm-hmm. So if you were to look out there in the world right now, are there flashpoints where you say, well, yeah, there's a surprise, right? Or there may be an element of surprise that is waiting to happen, right? So at first I read the two examples in conclusion, the Taiwan Strait and the Russian-Ukraine situation. I thought those were surprises, but then in the presentation you tell us that those are actually selected. But even in those two cases, you can imagine elements of surprise, right? And in hearing your responses to Rose, it seems like you can have these two situations somewhat intertwined.
Co-mingled,
so tell us a little bit more about surprises in the future, what they might look like.
Okay.
The second question, I think, gets back to some of the things that Mike was talking about, and that is this issue of deterrence and compellence potentially being murky, especially in multiple iterative rounds, right? And this is not an invitation for you and Charlie to tell me to retake my qualification exams. But I think even in your explanation of how you coded things, you admit that sometimes the political aim is actually deterrent, and the threat itself is compellant, or vice versa, and you sort of deal with these more ambiguous and hard cases. So, for example, you exclude North Korea, so North Korea to the U.S. and then the U.S. to North Korea as compellence in 2017. But even in late 2017, the U.S. started talking about regime change against North Korea, right? Pompeo coming out saying, well, we're going to try and separate the regime from its nuclear weapons. And Pence following up saying, well, everything is on the table, all options are on the table, so you think about that, Kim Jong-un. And fast forward to the New Year's address, Kim Jong-un comes out saying, well, okay, first of all, drop your regime change plans because I have a nuclear button on my desk. Which, of course, as you know, ended with Trump saying, well, actually, my button's bigger than yours.
Yes, in a very mature fashion, he said that.
Yeah, that's exactly how diplomacy should happen. But so if you add this case as compellence, you might be even more right. But I feel like this is more of a theoretical pushback that I'm making here, which is that it's really murky to distinguish between deterrence and compellence, especially because your theory at some level really requires that both sides, while the crisis is happening, both understand that this is a compelling situation, not a deterrent situation. And even with 2020 hindsight, we're sitting here like sort of twirling our thumb and we're like, how do you code this case? Is it deterrent or is it compellent? There's still so much room for interpretation, and I think that's something that you acknowledge in your manuscript as well. So how should I think about these dynamics?
So you're completely right. This deterrence compellence distinction, this is a problem in all this literature. It's not novel to us. So I can say mea culpa on that. It's not just affecting our study. And the more involved the crisis gets, sort of, it becomes more difficult to parse these out. So we're doing our best, and here I'm relying a lot on Todd Sexer to say, compellence is about changing the status quo, deterrence is about maintaining the status quo. But you're completely right that often those definitions or criteria are applied ahistorically, right? So what we perceive as deterrence of China to retaking Taiwan, they perceive as compellence, because they think Taiwan is theirs, and we're saying renounce it, give it up. And that is part of what makes it such an intractable situation, is the different understandings of what objectively looks like a similar situation, right? According to our definition and others who study this, that would be the U.S. threat would be a deterrent threat. But it's called, for cultural specific, China specific dispute reasons, is understood by them as compellence, like try to renounce your threat. So that's a problem that's sort of, endemic to this, and it's a really interesting question to think about. We don't have the magic solution to this, in that, except insofar as we, look really closely at what is said. And I think you're referring to the Berlin case and the India-Pakistan case, where they have a clear compellant aim. Khrushchev, get out of Berlin. We're gonna get out of West Berlin. We're gonna hand it over to the East Germans. You're gonna have to deal with them. So we're trying to compel you to lever you out of Berlin. And we're testing dozens of nuclear weapons, right? And we're moving nuclear weapons into East Germany, right? Big, signals of nuclear intent. And yet, what is Khrushchev saying? He's saying, well, if you start something, we have missiles too, we have tanks too, and if you Americans want to come in here and try and maintain your rights, we will retaliate. So all the rhetoric is deterrent, but what they're doing, the aim, like the demand is compellant, there's a nuclear threat that is in support of that demand. So,
And the North Koreans are really bad at this too, right? They
Oh,
always
yeah.
start by saying, if you do blah, blah, blah,
Yes,
blah, I
yes.
will do blah, 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 blah. But their aim is
yes.
not always very clear.
So-
I think you acknowledge this point.
And I've gone into those cases to some extent, and it's so hard to parse out. And I should look more at the one you mentioned. But I think most of the time, those cases don't tend to be very credible because there's not really much to back it up. So even if we added it, and there's a lot of these kind of marginal cases, like that if we added them, well, they're not really doing much to bolster the signal. Oh, and does this go till 6 or 6:30? 6. Oh, okay. So I'll talk really fast. So on your first question, are there any surprises out there? Well, the problem with surprises is that they're surprises, and we don't necessarily know about them. So that, they're difficult to predict. I don't perceive, I guess, like a Chinese threat in the context of a war with the United States over Taiwan to be that surprising, in the sense that we're thinking about it. Clearly, both sides will have taken into account the other side's nuclear arsenals, what's their interests, and so on. And so the result, I think, would come down to signaling. Now, it's clear we need to think more on the surprise selection distinction. And certainly the surprise is, this whole selection business is not like we invented it, right? This is well established out there. It's just not being applied, we think, in this situation where it should be applied. But it's not necessarily novel. The surprise thing, or the size of the updating, I guess you could put it, is sort of different from other stuff that's out there. So we could perhaps incorporate that in to a selection that the bigger the signal, the more surprising, the more contrary to the priors of the target a threat is, then the greater the impact it's going to have and the more credible the threat will be, ... So, thank you for the questions.
On a happy note, I see we're exactly on time. And we have a norm here, not taboos, with taboos, but a norm of starting on time and ending on time.
I thought it was going to be throwing rotten vegetables at the presenter.
Let's read
That comes later? Okay. That comes at dinner.
Please join me in thanking Professor Downs for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.